Okay, let's get our little show on the road. Welcome to Evolution Hour on the 22nd of July, 2024. Clickety clack. Remember all of our cute little WordPress.com. There's files there. Everybody can freely share them. They are kind of a foretaste of what we are up to in our current little project. So, whoa, is it hot? It's another 100-degree day today. Not quite as hot as some of the channels were predicting it. We didn't get that high, but nevertheless. And we also don't have the high humidity that you have in the east, so it's just normal dry heat. And woke up to the delightful news that President Biden has decided that he should put the nation and the election ahead of his own ambitions, and he decided to bow out of the case, and so hopefully we'll be able to swing into a Harris and fill in the blank candidacy for the election. Changes the dynamic. But anyway, this is not about politics. This is about the people who enable the politics. Some of the creationists here, the cute little Titans dinosaur book. And we brought up some more show and tell as well because of the various critters that are involved in our show today. 3 sauropods again in Sarfati and Tay's list did not have any notes, no science sources on them. Mamenchosaurus, Saltosaurus, and Shunosaurus. Now, Mamenchosaurus is something that's dear to the hearts of anybody that's intrigued by dinosaurs, and I brought up my old British Museum set that had Mamenchosaurus with its preposterously long neck done in a curvature, which is probably not possible. Most of the attitudes are that all of the sauropods basically have their necks out straight, and the other versions that the Carnegie Museum has and others are shown in that pose. Anyway, I thought it was an awfully cute little model. And then another one that is not on the list of Sarfati and Tay, but it's going to be popping up in the material that we're going to be discussing, is Cetiosaurus, which is on the same scale, roughly about the same body size, but with a smaller build. And then Saltosaurus, which I brought up my little Carnegie collection. It's got its little scoots that you can see, which is kind of distinctive. And I think even one of them has a bit of a tail club on the back end of one of these dinosaurs. This would be a little smaller if it were on the same scale as the British Museum series, but it's relatively accurate. And you can look a little closer to the head, that it's got kind of like that same high nasal brow ridge that you see in brachiosaurids and other kind of things. So how do they fit for the systematics? Well, you're not going to find out anything of that via anything in Sarfati and Tay because they never offered any sources, which immediately piqued my curiosity to see what had been done about Mamenchosaurids and these various others. Whoa, it turned out to be a delight because there were quite a few papers on this subject. Mamenchosaurus, there's a paper, in fact, I got a couple papers that I'll be putting links to for more in 2020 and Upchurch in 2023 on a new long neck one. They are all of relevance because they've got quite a lot of info on the systematics. The Upchurch paper gives some of the bigger picture items in there. And then this other paper from more on a cousin in the Chinese sauropod thing. And it is of particular interest because it's got a positive gold mine of the breakdown of the systematics, which reminds us, hi Lisa, oh my, how many dinosaurs are known today? And each one of them is a blip on the scope. Some of them are fragmentary fossils. Others are nearly complete. Depending upon which piece you have, each one of those be connected up as to what they can do for the systematics when they start plugging them into their little cladistic analysis things that can relate them in a systematic way. Another one on the field, Sarfatian tapeworm Saltosaurus as probably in the titanosaurid kind, which is interesting because Saltosaurids are given their own family, and therefore, presumably, that's a separate kind. The Ark Encounter lists Saltosaurids on their kind list. So there was a paper from Navarro from 2022, which was on another of their listing as a titanosaur, but in fact, when you look in the details, we're talking about the Saltosaurid. And just like the other papers, my, oh my, don't they have a detailed breakdown of the systematics as they're going into the regions that these things are living in and material that puts things into perspective. And what is popping up in a lot of this stuff is how they fit in with the titanosaurids generally, and then how things like cetiosaurids are kind of a basal group off as a cousin. And therefore you have to ask, how are they sure what kind they're in? Did you know stromatolites still exist? Yes, indeed they do. They're very uncommon. They require extremely, for any of you who don't know, they look kind of like big mushrooms, and they are basically layer cake of bacteria that grow in hypersaline environments. And so there's a little bay down in Australia, and I think there may be a couple other places that are also done, but they're very difficult to do because in a normal environment, little fish grazers are coming along, and so bacterial mats can't grow to the levels where they form a layer cake unless there's no predators to deal with them. Now, jump back before there were predators, and you've got whole reefs of stromatolites back in the Precambrian, and somebody like Todd Wood is trying to argue that these are contemporary with the animals that are living in the pre-flood environment, and so you're thinking maybe they're being washed in and destroyed by the big slosh waters. I mean, it's quite hilarious. But yeah, so they're an interesting bit about how the environment and the circumstances can change over time, and they don't come up a hell of a lot in the creationist lexicon, except for, say, Wood. Anyway, back to our little dinosaurs. Shunosaurus, which is the third one in the group that wasn't getting references this time around, is kind of intriguing. First of all, although it's fairly well known, it's an isolate. It's basically known from this one species. And there hasn't been any new systematics on it, as far as I can see, for 20 years. So you had some stuff from the early 2000s. But I will put in a paper from Wang from 2018, which is on the geologic deposit that Shunosaurus comes from. And also it's breaking down the data on where these things lived, and they're talking about the implications for paleogeography and the idea that good old China, which this map is showing a modern distribution, but you'd have to jump back to the Jurassic to realize that China is kind of like an isolated island complex, so that there is this group that then survive for a long period of time because they're no longer connecting up to the other groups, where a lot of these small Shunosaurid types are disappearing. And so that's another little sidebar. The whole systematic issue that really intrigues me also brings up that whole bit about that long neck of our cute little pal, Mamenchosaurus, which is something that's very distinctive between dinosaurs and mammals, and therefore, oh, how would all dinosaurs that live at the same time? Exactly. And it's not just dinosaurs all living at the same time. Remember, you have got everything in the fossil record, for all practical purposes, all living at the same time. So they can kind of wiffle waffle around the idea of stromatolite reefs being in the early creation week stuff. But for all practical purposes, they've got to have dinosaurs and like okay, come. Okay, timer's going again, so it looks like we're reconnected. Whee! Andrew Snelling, bless his sweet little heart, tries to argue that all of the mammoths and mastodons evolved after the flood, and in fact, after the Tower of Babel, which is an astonishing phenomenon. So we're talking about the times of Bronze Age cultures, and this is just hilarious. Needless to say, this hasn't exactly caught on fire with that. But anyway, simultaneity is a difficulty. It's awkward enough for terrestrial animals. It's catastrophically stupid for marine life, because you have to argue that somehow or other, not a single pesky little anomalocard and a seal and a plesiosaur and a mosasaur and a killer whale never once ever swiggled together anywhere on the planet. Amazing phenomena, in addition to all the species of fish and all the other kinds of stuff that you have. And in addition to working out how many kinds there are. So that's one of the tremendous difficulties that you get into in any attempt to try to cram all of this material, which went on last week with the Empire State Building analogy. They're facing that on a colossal scale. Anyhow, the thing about Mamenchosaurus necks is a reminder of the fact that, unlike us boring mammals, where with only two exceptions, manatees, and I can't remember who the other one is, that have more than 7 vertebrae, I think they've got like 8. Every mammal, from mouse to us to giraffes, all have the same number of neck vertebrae. They may change in size and shape, but nonetheless, they're all the same ones. We mammals are extremely boring. Generally speaking, we mammals aren't very good at the digit losing thing. There are a few ones. Horses, of course, have gotten to be single-toed critters and that sort of thing. But it's kind of a rarity. The pentadactyl format is very, very common in Mammalia. Not so much over in dinosaur land. And it would be an interesting thing to work out, because all we have are the living dinosaurs, the birds, as examples to deal with. And there's actually been some technical literature, which we alluded to in Rocks Were There Volume 1, about the digit variation issue. But the point is the neck vertebrae stuff indicates that there is a plasticity to the diapsids, and particularly into dinosaurs, where they can adjust the number of neck vertebrae from one species to another in a way that is very uncommon in mammals. And so there are developmental constraints. There's probably pleiotropic gene developments and regulatory sequences, which some future super duper fabulously clever paleogenomic studies may be able to work their way through and figure out what it is, because it won't necessarily be this century, although maybe it might. But theoretically, you can imagine super paleogenomics of a future time modeling the genetic interactions to work out what combinations they need to do to generate the shapes of the vertebrae they can see in Mamenchosaurids and the number of them, and therefore work out what the genome system likely was. There may be more than one way to do this. We know so many different issues, even in the development of like bird beaks, that a bunch of different genes are involved. And so there may be multiple different ways to arrive at a similar conclusion, which is one of the reasons why convergence pops up in the genetic environment so often in life, because there's more than one way for a gene to play out. And this will be interesting to see that contrasted with the nothing burger that you get in the anti-evolution movement, whether it's in the intelligent design camp or in the young Earth creationist camp, and really nothing but asterisks over in old Earth creationism, where they're basically people coming from like the physics astronomy end, and you don't really have a hell of a lot of people that deal with the biology end at all over in that neck of the woods. However, in the new volume 2 of The Rocks Were There, which we are currently working on, we're going to be going into quite a lot of that material on plasticity and multiple gene routes and the various genetic trails that people have worked out in the whole course of that tetrapod evolution. And there will be material on what paleogenomics is already trying to work out as to what genetic systems were getting involved in the Ediacara and biota. There's an awful lot of material that's been done on this, and it's 9,000 miles away from what creationists are. So we'll get on to part 2 then. Before I get to part 2, maybe I should also zap up and put up my thank you everybody patrons routine, because I can assure you, without all of your help, it would be a hell of a lot more awkward every bloody month. And thank you, all of our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers and friends and the various legacy patrons we've had over the years, and every one of you that's sticking with me. I know some live in places that are in all sorts of turmoil, and yet they're still helping. So zippity doo, we thank you very, very much, and couldn't do without you. So part two is, of course, the wonderful, exciting world of the Casey Luskin papers. To reprise everybody, every other week I'm doing this, and I'm now in the 6th installment of it, which is the long list of 800 plus papers that the Discovery Institute dropped on their website, presumably to intimidate anybody who had the temerity to disagree with Casey Luskin on the matter of whether junk DNA was a thing or not. Well, Dan Stern Cardinale has been continuing to temerity, and that's been a fun thing to watch. But point is, I, being an anal retentive source geek, saw this as a wonderful opportunity. We're going down through every damned one of them. And so the next listing here is to a bunch of papers. And I'll give them the credit. Most all of the material that I've been encountering so far is very recent. Some of it's so recent that I can't even give a direct reference to it because there's no full text thing. But we try to do as much as we can if possible. And this case is one where we will be putting up an abstract rather than the whole thing itself because it isn't available anywhere open access yet. So what do we got going here? The issue of retrotransposons can gather together and they can act as a trigger for activity sometimes in the genome. That's like not an amazing statement. Creationist papers. Well, there ain't no creationist papers on this front. These are all papers in the regular scientific literature that Luskin and company at the Discovery Institute are offering as unassailable evidence for their position. So they implied, wow, 800 papers. Why? Who the hell's going to be going through all of those? I bet nobody would. I'm just most curious about it. So, as you may have known for the past weeks, we have been going through them little bit by little bit in order. At the moment, we're plowing down through that vast ALU section. The next one we have encountered is from Lee and Shen from 2023. And again, this, I point out, it does not have an abstract available, but we will be linking to the Science Direct thing where you get a chunk of it. You get some of the footnotings, and so it's more than just the abstract. It's a good chunk of it. But some of the follow-up to that paper that is related to it turns out to be not only papers that I encountered while doing the follow-up on that work, but they ended up, all three of them, ending up on the McClatchy list, where McClatchy came along after the Luskin Dan Stern Cardinale debate and was saying, oh, you silly evolutionists, don't you know that little teeny short stretches of DNA, these retrotransposons can act as promoters? Ha ha! And so I had that as a reserve item. Well, it turns out that this 2021 paper from Lu from Nature and a commentary piece on that by Liang and Fu 2021, also in Nature, both ended up on that list. Now, the Liang piece noted how not all of the retrotransposons were transcribed, which again reinforces the whole issue. Hi, Vandalia. Whee! It reinforces the whole point about the wishful thinking of Luskin, which is that most of the air quotes junk DNA actually is functional. Well, this paper is clearly not making any such assertion on that, and is pointing out how not all of them are transcribed. They're only interested in the little teeny niche part that relates to it. And because the genome is so ginormous, you can have millions of retrotransposons and only a tiny proportion of them, 1% or so, that's still tens of thousands of them doing various things in various contexts. As we've already pointed out in previous installments of this, some of this is not to do anything at all to do with the sequence of the retrotransposon, but the mere presence of them in blocks that act as triggering points and focal points. In this case, the chromatin system, which is the thing that folds the DNA around and is used to package things in the transcription sequencing as to whether or not they decide to go with a part or just bypass it. So there's another work that did not appear on the Luskin list that I encountered by Kapitonov from 2009, which explains a lot about the whole non-LTR retrotransposon issue and how many of them there are and how they were discovered and how they would be investigated in future. Now, what's interesting is none of this little cluster directly triggers the theodicy issue. So this time around, there were no little markers that added on to that. But it's also not supporting the position that they want, which is that Dan Stern Cardinale's case, which he has reinforced in his most recent response to Luskin and company, which is that any stretch of junk DNA, which actually is doing something, we will be able to spot that because it will be shown to be under purifying selection, which is to say there are things that are preventing too many mutations from building up because it's sequence specific to do a specific thing, which means if it accumulates too many mutations, it'll fall outside of that parameter and stop doing what it's supposed to be doing. So that purifying selection issue is one of the tools that you can use to help give a ballpark as to whether or not something is functional. And that is the point that Dan has been trying to make with Luskin, and it's been going right over his head every single time. So I find that should be absolutely ticking. Funny you should be talking about sauropods since I did a video on them last week. Yeah, the sauropods are quite a fascinating thing. There's been a whole, I can't say revolution because this dust is still in the air, but as to whether or not sauropods and theropods are all in a group of the Saurischian dinosaurs or are actually separate, and there were that Herrerasaur bunch that branches off, and then you get the Ornithischians and sauropod groupings occurring independently. And it can be fairly say that there's still open air circumstances on things. Once you get past the formation of these early clades, things start settling down enormously, and it doesn't matter how closely theropods are to sauropods or whatever in that deep rooting back in the Herrerasaur period during the Triassic, because they're all off on their own things. Don't neutral mutations support junk DNA statement? Well, the fact that most mutations are neutral, or even if they're just slightly deleterious, they can still track along. There was a brand new paper that we're going to be alluding to in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There that Zach Hancock brought to our attention in our little discussion group. That is just a zinger of a paper because it demonstrated how small deleterious mutations can actually allow beneficial mutations to hitchhike into fixation more efficiently. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm suddenly doing my Tucker Carlson laugh. And it's an absolutely delicious little paper that I wouldn't have even heard about. But Hancock is a geneticist, and so he is right deep in all of this material and explains it rather nicely on this. So we're giving a little nod to Zach in the new book about this subject. It's just amazing all the new science material that's popped along on that stuff. So they can estimate how long the laryngeal nerve in the sauropods is. Yeah. One of the things that makes it awkward is study of that. And there are quite a few papers of that have gone into the issue about not just the laryngeal nerve, but the whole point about the amount of pumping power needed to get blood up to the skull of any sauropod if its neck is raised too high. And were there other mechanisms, if one could go back in and look at actual biologically living sauropods, are there aspects to their musculature and the way things are organized around their neck vertebrae and the like that maybe acts as a pulsating pumping system that we're missing because there's no counterpart of that in the birds, which are their only living relatives? If we had actual dinosaurs to look at and their DNA, we would have a totally different mix to look at, but we don't. All we have that we can infer part of it is what we know from birds, which are from a niche group of feathered theropods, which is maybe not all that close to sauropods, remember. So they're sufficiently far removed from the field that it's very difficult to be able to do this purely by making analogies from living systems. But there is enough biomechanics work that makes it relatively unlikely, based upon our current knowledge, that any of the sauropods would have had their neck in that super duper mode. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if we were able to get into a time machine and look back, that we would have found out that things are much more interesting even than that. Maybe there would be a surprise. A similar issue comes along as to whether sauropods could rear. Because as I pointed out in one of the earlier renditions, the one that's in the American Museum, or no, maybe it's the Boston Museum, that famous rearing dinosaur that would be intimidating as hell for any theropod that was trying to attack it with its great big claws and all of that mass about ready to come down on you. But could it do that? I know that in the older days, certainly a Robert Bakker type would be taking that attitude that the sauropods could do some of those things, and pointing out how the neural spines and things that are often very, oh, yes, that's an interesting issue about how the fact that Apatosauruses, Diplodocids, and that crowd have very tall vertebral spines in their body region, which in part are presumably acting like a musculature suspension bridge between the head and the tail to maintain things. What's interesting is you don't find these high spines on brachiosaurs and that bunch, where their neck presumably was already partially elevated just from the way that it was structured in the body, not necessarily up high, but out like so. Could our legs serve as a model for the blood? Not sure, again, because we're mammals. So that's a hard-pressed issue to deal with because we've got so much divergence on. Anyway, another one that doesn't have those high neck, those vertebral spines are Mamenchosauruses. So what was going on in the muscular system that was holding things up and balancing stuff out when they didn't have that? So one of the hypotheses that Baker would have been favoring, I haven't heard whether or not he's Robert Bakker, whether he, the guy with the ponytail and the Lutheran preacher as well, whether he would still be arguing that the ones that have that kind of a layout theoretically have the ability to put enough leverage on themselves that they could do that rearing trick. So kids, if you're working on a time machine so that we can go back to the Mesozoic to find this out, keep at it, although make sure you have enough AAA batteries, because I bet that mother is going to be a real big power hog, and we'll have to see what's going on there. And maybe they can use the old batteries from extinct Tesla Cybertrucks, which are the Edsel of the 21st century. Oh, like I am using the frog DNA for you. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's that. An awful lot about Jurassic Park makes for perfectly fine entertainment, but there's just oodles of stuff, which was problematic even when the movie was made back in the 1990s, but is increasingly untenable now. Remember that although Michael Crichton was kind of a sciencey geek, he could also fall off the cliff on things, which is why towards the end of his life, he got the big bug about being skeptical about climate change. The same problem popped up with Tom Wolfe, the Right Stuff guy, with his doubts about evolution, where he was kind of filtering in stuff from the Intelligent Design Discovery Institute crowd. And in a completely different context, we allude to it in the books. Yes, he was an MD. That Earl Stanley Gardner was somebody who had his weird little moments late in life where he was getting on the Aaron Combo dinosaur sculptures gig that was just hitting in the 1960s, and did a couple books on it. And then, of course, the infamous case with Arthur Conan Doyle and the fairy folk back in the 1920s. So it's perfectly feasible, particularly for elderly folk who are used to analytical thinking and thinking they can't be wrong on something, being not up enough on the curve and coming at stuff from just little tiny little snippets, and starting to make an ass of themselves. This happens. I'm trying to avoid that in my own life. I want to make sure that I'm at the cutting edge of the actual reality of things, and to be as careful as all get out. And I think so far, knock wood, we're holding our own on that front. That doesn't mean that not immensely entertaining things. In fact, Jurassic Park is not my favorite Michael Crichton movie. My all-time favorite Michael Crichton science fiction is Andromeda Strain, and I still watch that as one of the most deliciously ingenious alien invasion threat stories that embodies the whole idea about the issues of government bureaucracy and how people can make a reasonable decision scientifically that turns out to be a disastrous one when you realize the context is something you hadn't realized. And the way they deal with the dropping the bomb on Piedmont in the Andromeda Strain, and discovering, that's not a good idea, is a delightful bit, and I'm very fond of that as a story. It's a rip-snortingly interesting thing. One of the very few science fiction films, by the way, with an all-electronic score. I'll just type that into the little message here. The Andromeda Strain. There was a version of it done on TV a ways back. I think it was an Australian bunch that did it. It was like a little mini series where they did a time travel story plot that they grafted onto it, and it was just But the original, Andromeda Strain. There we go. Whoops. I put that up at the fact that it's bloody hell still hot. It's 88 degrees outside. It's about that temperature, and here it is at near 1 o'clock in the morning. We're supposed to go down to maybe the mid 70s by the wee hours, and then climb back up to the 100 by the time the heat of the stuff goes. Anyway, I didn't know about the ER TV series. An awful lot of people did an awful lot of things. Various people have. My favorite for somebody sticking their foot in so many different venues was Ian Fleming, because he not only did Bond, James Bond, but the Secret Agent series, which was originally called Danger Man, with Patrick. Good Lord, I've suddenly forgotten his name. Anyway, he had John Drake. And then he also created the Man from U.N.C.L.E. series, and then inadvertently caused one of the big flaps in the whole James Bond cycle, because he came up with a plot with McClory, the Thunderball storyline that created the Spectre organization. And in the early James Bond movies, they alluded to that without actually clearing it with McClory. And so McClory sued, and there was this long-standing lawsuit that went on that was finally settled, so that they had to film Thunderball, which is why Thunderball was filmed after Goldfinger rather than On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is what they were going to do. And then eventually the Never Say Never Again, where he 20 years later, he was able to make a second version of it, which really wasn't all that much better than the first version, which was, okay. So anyway, why are we so different? We don't live that far apart. Oh, yeah, there can be all sorts of ups and downs as to why temperatures zip along as they do. We've got a giant heat dome that's covering half of the country, and there's the jet stream, and that is kind of bumped upwards into Canada, and so we're all kind of stuck in this mode for a while. But all depends on little microclimate blips. Washington State and eastern Idaho, northern Idaho, that part, is all in this same mix-up. So we're all looking to be around in the 100-degree things all the way into the central part of the state, which, remember, is kind of like high desert. And I was struck. There was a show on European railroads that they were rerunning on one of the public broadcasting subchannels, and I'd seen it earlier, but I was just watching it again because it was so neat scenery. And they happened to be up at one of the viewpoints up, and I think looking at the big three mountains, the Eiger and others up there in Germany or in Switzerland, and pointed out that they were at an altitude 4,000 some odd feet above sea level. And I realized that's below the continental divide in New Mexico, which is like 5,200 feet. And so I realized how surprisingly low an awful lot of Europe is, even though it's excessively bumpy. I was reminded, frankly, that the Alps are kind of like the Olympic mountains, which are relatively comparable height, and they're stuck over next to relative sea level thing, as opposed to the great big high plateau where there aren't really too many mountain ranges, relatively low mountains that are stuck up as the Colorado Plateau gets pushed up. My niece, of course, who's very reactive to high altitudes, anything up about anything above about 3,000 feet really gets her. So all during a trip that we took back east, where we were driving in these high altitude areas, it was just driving her nuts. Yeah. I mean, yeah. What part of Oregon, Lisa? In the Portland side? So all that I can see from the indications are that heat dome is still in the eastern part, in that because eastern Oregon is kind of high desert in that as well. When you get over onto the coast, I'm not sure what Seattle and stuff are in. I'm sure they're also supposed to be kind of at least in the 80s category. Anyway, everything is kind of flunky, and everybody make sure. Oh, Eugene, okay. Well, well, the thing that worries me, and one of the dark joke that has been made by some people, is that will we be looking back on the weather we're having now as the cool years, back when, oh my gosh, it was only 105 degrees during the summers back when I was a woo. We don't want that to be the case, which is one of the reasons why we have to be really sure to vote out as many of the scientific illiterate climate deniers that are basically the Trumpista party. And those who follow me on Twitter will notice I had alluded to the fact that I got my little Washington Progressive Guide. That is one of the measures that I use to find out where people are on the candidacy, because we have an awful lot of positions that are nonpartisan in a lot of the judicial positions and others that are not listed party affiliations. So you don't have a measure of things. So you have to find out who's endorsing them and who isn't. And that can give you a litmus test as to whether or not somebody has their brain in sync or not. So if you have somebody that would be endorsing Donald Trump and the extremists that are currently at big chunks of the Republican Party here in Washington state, then that is an instantaneous indication that these people have an agenda and a background that, for me, rules them out, because they're going to be making dumb decisions like we're getting from the Supreme Court, that with all those Trumpistas on it, or Judge Cannon deciding to dismiss the documents case. We'll see. We'll see if that gets a change when a venue, if they refile on appeal, and all is flex. And of course, it's critical that Trump not be president in 2025, so that whatever the legal gears can grind, even if they continue to grind slowly, that they can at least grind and not be pulled the plug out from under them by Trump simply decreeing to the Justice Department that they stop all of these things. So we're facing with an awful lot of stuff. We've got so many serious climate issues. It was particularly ironic for me. Here, I'll go on a little mini rant. Particularly ironic that Elon Musk of Tesla has decided to funnel like $150+ million to the Trump campaign. Doesn't he know that the Trump platform, which is basically his Trump speech, wants to end subsidies and help to electric cars? He wants everything to go back to gas guzzler thingy, I guess. And so this is not exactly something that is going to be Tesla friendly, kids. Does he not cross-check notes on things? I don't know. So at any rate, yeah, Biden's out. I think he was a very good president, and he will continue to be a good president filling out his term. Maybe he'll be able to focus more now. I'm sure he'll be doing some campaigning and all the rest, but it certainly transforms the issue. What we'll be keeping my eye out for is to see who gets chosen for the vice presidential candidate, and how all that fits into the idea that the critical things, I think the new future president, former president, will pick as their new VP. It's all up in the air. There's a bunch of different people that have been put around. My original 2020, yes, Musk is a moron, although that is to some extent an insult to morons. He's an era. It reminds me in some respects of a Henry Ford type, although he's not even the tinkerer that Henry Ford was. A lot of the companies and things that he's done, he didn't invent. He just bought the company and then exploit it and all the rest. But anyway, that's a sidebar. But my original 2020 candidate mix was Harris Buttigieg. And I thought that would certainly be a funky little thing to deal with. And since Mayor Pete has turned out to be a really hot stuff Secretary of Transportation and has shown himself to be on a high learning curve where he can go and tussle effectively on even Fox News, that would be an interesting one. If they pick a woman candidate, that would be an interesting thing. So you'll have two women candidate going against the two nutball men, with Vance, who is like a mini me Trump, a person who is, oh, good Lord, an anger-filled ideologue, really, and who either is somebody who is a craven Aaron Burr style opportunist who will change his politics to suit whatever works, because he's gone from private citizen to senator to vice presidential candidate in the space of only 2 bloody years. Or he's somebody that really does believe what he says, and he went through a tremendous epiphany and became a Trumpista, which means, goodness gravy, he must have completely flushed any capacity to fact check anything down the toilet. Perhaps it's the case that he never did have a good capacity to fact check things. I would really love to see more source methods questions to be asked of candidates, to find out how they assemble their arguments, what sources do they rely on, and how do they go about fact checking them if they do. And I would contend that an awful lot of people would be disqualified from a rigorous vote on those grounds if we would look at them more. Get the whole age range going. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the field that have been discussed, many of them are well within the right age range to make them certainly comparable to Vance. Vance, at I think any age, would be unqualified for this. And remember, too, if Trump wins, Vance would be the vice president to preside over the Senate, and presumably would be angling to become the mini-me to take over once Trump has to retire. Although, would Trump try to find some way to get around the fact that this would be a second term and that would be the end of his political career? Would he still try to control the shots, even from, the king at Mar-a-Lago dictating things? And would anybody go along with that? But I don't want the poor little Republican Party to have to go through that level of self-immolation. They should not win in 2024 to begin with. And so they'll have to start thinking about what to do as to whether or not there can even be a functional Republican Party that is not a Trump vanity party. I'm beginning to think that they're dead as a doornail. And so you've got a variety of the Republicans who are now voting Democrat, the Adam Kinzinger types and others, who have to stick it out to see if they're ever going to have a new political party that will be able to restore some of the attitudes that was in the old Republican Party, the one of Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and even Ronald Reagan. So, yes, Putin is his role model, yes. And I'm sure a Trump Vance ticket would be a delight for Putin to see in office, because he would have Trump, who he can manipulate. And frankly, there's some argument to think that Vance wants to be a manipulator, to intrude as much of that Project 2025 claptrap into things to make sure that he's maintaining that agenda. And there's just way too wrong about all of that, that it's got to marshal votes all over the place. So anyway, one of the criteria then for a vice presidential candidate for Harris would be somebody that, as a unit, will make it as open as possible for as many ways for Harris blank to get the 270 electoral votes, and make it as awkward as possible, or put as many obstacles in play to try to prevent Trump from getting that 270. We know that he managed. We know that he managed it once in 2016, and then he didn't manage it in 2020. And so, all depending upon those little vote issues, in Pennsylvania, where the big population of Philadelphia is such a big decider, in Nevada, where Las Vegas matters, and such, in Georgia, where Atlanta is such a big player. And so there's just lots and lots of variables to deal with it. And it was looking like the path to 270 with Biden running as the old man was starting to get awkward, and some people were worried that the Democrats might lose the Senate, and they were thinking that the Democrats wouldn't be able to retake the House, and so we would be denied the chance to have Speaker Jeffries, would have more years of little creationist nutball Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. Yeah, I'm not sure about Kemp and Shapiro there. I don't follow the chessboard on a lot of these candidates to where I can viewpoint, and presumably all this will be coming out as everything goes into high gear leading up to the Democratic convention next month. That one's going to be a fun one to see what the situation is. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that the little attack dogs, and make no mistake about it, Trump has probably one of the most professional teams of media consultants operating in his 2024 campaign compared to 2020 and 2016. And so they've made the pact with the devil and are working their darndest to put Trump over the top on things. None of that's changed my opinion of the fellow, because I know too much about his record. When Vance makes blither blather statements about how good the economy was under Trump, I would just have to say, based on what? I think a fun one would be to take the past 4 administrations and just mark out what their growth rate quarterly is, and then take those 4, which would be Biden, Trump, and the 2 Obama terms, and mix them up so you don't know what order they're in. And then ask Vance to pick out which one he thinks is the stupendous, better than ever, the best ever supposed Trump economy. Now, from what I've seen about the growth rate matters, he ain't going to be able to do that, because the most you could say is the Trump administration's quarterly growth rates was about the same as the Biden or the Obama administration. No better, no worse. Meanwhile, there was that ticking time bomb of the 2017 tax bill that was going to be punting down the road charge account debt starting in the 2020s, which is exactly what happened. And amazingly, the Biden administration has managed to whittle down a lot of that debt structure fairly effectively. But more needs to be done, and we can guarantee that nothing meaningful is going to be done if the Republicans continue to hold the House, and especially if they get control of the Senate, and worse, if they get the bloody president. So there we go. Yeah, we couldn't get toilet paper. Yeah. And that messianic aspect to Trump is not something that is recent, or it's been exacerbated by the assassination attempt. And so they feel that the hand of God has stayed the bullet to preserve their God King, their Cyrus. So the people that were idolatrous of him before have just gone in steroids. But I, cynical person that I am, can go, the Lord might very easily have stayed the bullet, because Mr. Trump has not yet got his comeuppance. He is not to be permitted to pass on now, because he has a bunch of trials he needs to go through. Remember, Mr. Trump can only avoid legal problems if he can stay out of court. And in virtually every instance, when he actually gets into a court case, it doesn't come out well. Back in the old days, he was able to maneuver around some of this stuff by paying big fines and settling out of court. That's what happened with the discrimination case back in the 70s with when Roy Cohn was his lawyer. And then he would just go out and lie and say he won it. But in the recent instances, the financial fraud case and he has been convicted by a judge and or jury directly. And I have every reason to think that his track record on this is not maybe going to get any better if it can manage to get into a court. So it's absolutely imperative that he not be president in 2025, so that at the very least, the mechanisms can continue to grind on and things can happen. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, I don't know about the bullet grazing matter. He certainly played it up. And of course, all the little sycophants there put their little ear bandage on in solidarity with him and all of that. And Trump, of course, is playing the hand of God bit. Tucker Carlson was up there doing that, Mr. Giggles. And quite a few of the other people were positively burbling about it, Marjorie Taylor Greene and others. And so this just reinforced what was already in the case, that the Tony Perkins class of theocratic creationists was seeing him as their instrument. And from their point of view, why wouldn't they think so? Donald Trump managed to pull off the thing with the courts, putting anti-abortion judges on at a level that nobody had seen happen under Reagan or Bush. So he could rightly say he fulfilled that promise. Now, Kamala Harris has been very forthright in campaigning already on the fact that, yes, that's part of the problem, is that they put these people on the courts and they overturned Roe v. Wade and raised a whole can of worms. And they've got a whole slew of extremists just chomping at the bit to turn that into a nationwide abortion ban and elimination of IVF and contraceptives. Because remember, there's a whole bunch of hyper-conservative Catholics that don't like the idea of birth control in any form. They haven't for the last 50 years and they haven't changed. And a lot of the people circulating around the Trump orbit are of these hyper Catholics. Vance apparently has joined the brigade, and you got Candace Owen and others that have joined this hyper conservative bit. And that brand of theocratic hyper conservative, the ones that don't like Vatican II, are also the most extremist in the creationist community. These are the most likely to be geocentric creationists, for example. So anyway, it's a most interesting thing. I think we had a really nice discussion on that, and at least my connection was able to hold up on that little bit. I am certainly no legal scholar, but I am old enough to be able to put a little bit of the perspective about things, and I am a historian as well, BA in history, so that I try to put that context of things. From what we can see, the only reason why Trump was able to get so many bloody people on the court is because Mitch McConnell controlled the Senate. And so he slowed down Obama's, because they regained control of the Senate partway during the administration. And he slowed Obama court appointments down to a crawl and stopped the Merrick Garland Supreme Court nomination completely. And then once Trump was in power, gear shift, boop, speed things up. And he was just ramming people through, usually with very narrow partisan votes. Some of the ones that were unqualified, that have been doing dumb decisions. The IVF decision that came down in one of the circuit courts was from a Trump guy. The bit about the cannon in Florida, that's another Trump appointment. So the fact that these people are on the court, they're going to be screwing things up for us for quite a long time to come, unless you have enough people in Congress and the Senate and ultimately in the state houses and other areas to compensate for these and to pass laws, or in some cases put through amendments. And this is going to be multi-decade long project. I suspect some of the things for like gun reform and that will probably require some constitutional amendments, because the stupid court rulings that they've been coming up with, and they're going to be dominating the court for the next 20 years or so. So, seen a little message. Rosemary Grant is 87 years old and still doing work. Yeah. And so we're going to be finding an interesting thing for the next months to see how things are going. And as the Democrats gear up their campaign and get their ads and that going, and the fear-mongering campaign from the Republicans continues, everybody knows they're going to do it. But only voter turnout. It's not, as I pointed out in other contexts, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that Trump can carry Washington State. There's too many progressives over on the east side of the state, and Spokane, the metropolitan area, often votes in Democrats, even though we have yet to finally dislodge to get a Democrat in to replace. We'll see whether or not we can Kathy McMorris Rogers. Meanwhile, over in Idaho, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that any Democrat is going to take the Idaho electoral votes. So we're in a spot which is kind of irrelevant. It's in these swing states, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and others, where those electoral votes can chick-chuck up to where you can squeak in and get a victory, even if you don't get the the popular vote. If the nation is deteriorated to the point that Trump actually wins the popular vote in a landslide, well, hell, yikes, we're screwed. So we'll see how that thing goes. Think at this rate, the new Supreme Court will overthrow Kitzmiller. Well, Kitzmiller v. Dover is not a federal case. It's at a district level. And so technically, they really don't have a jurisdiction there. However, as I pointed out on the talk with you, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that an anti-evolution bill in one of the states can be deliberately designed to trigger a court ruling that the Supreme Court will need to weigh itself in on. And they would not be dealing with Kitzmiller v. Dover. I would think it much more likely that they would come at it from Edwards v. Aguilar, the one that banned the teaching of creationism in the schools, because the dissent on that was written by Scalia. Anybody that wants to read my opinion on it, go to my website, go to the tip 1.6, and there is a whole section on Justice Scalia's screwball dissent from Edwards v. Aguilar. And given how the Trumpistas just worship at the feet of the reputation of Scalia, I could easily see an Alito and others dusting off that Scalia defense and using it as a way of overturning Edwards v. Aguilar. Well, that would not only allow intelligent design in, it would allow full-blown creationism to be taught in the schools. And why would somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Speaker Johnson object to that? They're young earth creationists. They would go, well, now they get to teach the proper science. So that could happen independent of who wins in 2024. But I think there's more than ample reason not to want to have Trump or any Trumpista in power, and not to have Vance presiding over the Senate and casting tie votes, just in case it is a really tight Senate. So this election matters, kids. And anybody that's way younger than this old fart had jolly well better be registered, and you jolly well better vote, because it may turn out that you won't get much of a chance of it if the ideologues who will want to gerrymander and voter restriction up the yin yang. You have one of the states, I can never remember whether it's Wisconsin, or I think it's Wisconsin, where the voters routinely vote for Democrats and Democratic policies, but because everything's been gerrymandered so much, Republicans still get the majority of the votes. And that's just absolute nutcase. That's not good for the Republic, and it's not good for their state, and not for anywhere else, because anybody that's going to be living in the rest of this century realizes that the decisions that we're making now on climate and infrastructure and technology and economic policy and tax policy and international relations, etc., have impact spooling out over decades. We didn't get into the cataclysmic disaster of the 1940s overnight. We had decades of bad decisions in the United States and other spots that greased the skids for the disasters that we had with that paper hanger in Berlin, who only came on the scene in 1933 and only had shit hit fan in 1939. So long-term projects, these things have long-term issues. And so you have to pay attention at every level in this area. You can't go asleep at the switch and say, oh, gosh, it doesn't matter. So anyway, yes, voting in every election since Bush v. Gore. I voted in every election once I could vote. And I've tried to pay the best attention I could. I was an old Reagan voter during those years, although I had some problems with essential American policy. As I pointed out, I was so flabbergasted when they took Elliott Abrams out of mothballs to try to deal with Maduro down in Venezuela. And look how well that worked out. Yipes. So these things matter. And anybody that's young is going to have to be living in the century. I hope to stay an annoying old jerk well down past the 2050s if I can pull it off. But that's only partway into the century. Anybody that's quite young, Jackson could easily live, if he muddles along, he can live to see 2100. And I'd like to have him live in a world that he would enjoy living in, not one where they look back and go, oh my God, that mistake we made in 2024. Yikes, I wish we could correct that. Well, tick, 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 tick. The time is going on. Yeah, some of them think Jesus is coming back, so they don't care. Yeah, you're Mike Pompeo, Trump's final Secretary of State. He is an end times guy. I'd love to have seen, if you were to poll the people at the convention, about a lot of their views on these things, but they tend not to do that. They'll ask the interviewers, and will be talking with people on the floor. Of course, to some extent, they can't be confrontational because otherwise they might get thrown out. But still, they're talking about some issues, but not really some of these little core areas, which is why I would want to know, every single delegate at that convention, how old do they think the Earth is? Do they accept evolution? Do they accept climate science? And which so not? Do they think Jesus Christ is coming back anytime soon? How many dinosaurs do they think were on Noah's Ark? And I think the illusions that some of the people who are not in the extremist wing have, if they were to find that out, because they don't talk about a lot of this stuff. There's an awful lot of those sort of Federalist Society style conservatives who will be rubbing shoulders with Tony Perkins style ideologues and never for a moment ask him what he thinks about Ken Ham's Ark encounter, even though he is a young Earth creationist, and they just don't think about talking about all this stuff. So, yeah, yes. Well, poor George Bush looks like a moderate by modern day standards. The Trumpista Vanity Party has polarized things on their end. It's not the case with the Democrats. The Democrats are still a diverse party. You have people who are quite conservative, the Joe Manchin types, all the way out. And some of them, of course, have quit the party and tried to become independent or rearrange their sort of things, all the way out to your Bernie Sanders style on the outer fringes of democratic socialism, the Ocasio-Cortez and others. But there is no counterpart of that in that shrunken homunculus of the Republicans, the Trumpistas, that have turned into a party that has extreme conservatives and really extreme conservatives and eye-twitching, you can't believe how extreme conservatives they are. That's the Trumpistas. There are functionally no moderates anymore. And so they're going to have to toe the line, let alone liberals. I remember when the Republican Party actually had liberals in it, the Nelson Rockefeller types, and that's gone poof. It means that in the current state of the Republican Party, they should be politically extinct. And I would like to live long enough to see the last Republicans in Congress. Ha ha. There may be a new branch. The Adam Kinzigers may call it the Lincoln Party, maybe start from scratch. Oh, so anyway, my God, we blurbled past a whole hour. So let me put my advert for the book up. Which always is very noisy. And there we go. Get our little thing on. And remember, it is available in a delightful paperback and or ebook, Kindle. And we're very, very proud of it. Volume 2 is going to be even more kick butt. And I've been learning things about how to improve the indexing and cross-referencing of things. It's fun. And I know that Dan Stern Cardinale and Dapper Dino and others all swear by what a invaluable resource the Rochwood area is, that they can go to and find stuff in this venue that you can't find anywhere else as fast, not even bloody Google. And we endeavor that Rochwood Air Volume 2 will continue that and finish off that superstructure. It was fun writing it, and it's fun writing the new book. Jackson and I learned so much and developed so many ideas from one another that because he has the advantage of coming from the biological world at the starting out level. I mean, he's got his new master's degree and all of that, and he's an actual teacher, and so he's interacting at a level that I, old fart with my BA in history, but long memory, So I have experience going all the way back into the 70s and 80s brands of creationism and the whole roots of where the intelligent design movement had come out. And I've been following the players on all these little fields so I can see the little cross connections in ways that aren't so immediately apparent. Plus, some of the stuff, we have alluded to it occasionally in the various books, are internet material that was there for a while and disappeared. And so there's a certain amount of that paper trail that unless you made a paper trail for it, you wouldn't realize some of the connections. That whole section that we did on the Creation Wiki account of the reptile mammal transition was riffing off of an earlier version of it by Krieger, that the internet version that exists now, you would never know that that was Krieger who had done that. But Krieger's earlier material was under his own name, and that stuff is not available online. I had a hard copy printout of it. So there is a certain degree that we're able to piece together all of this stuff, and we'll be doing the same thing for all the other projects that we'll be dealing with. Probably the book on the conspiracy thinking mindset will be the first off the mark. And then I have the sneaking fear it's going to be a 3-volume big one, and that's the origin, evolution, and structure of why religion exists in the world and how it's operated in the social contexts and all of that stuff. And that's I already accumulated a ginormous amount of material on that. It's the biggest swath of reference material of any of the various topics that I've dealt with, and we'll, I think, have a great deal of fun working on that little thing. One of these days, I'll also have perspectives of taking the Culture Camp book, which is basically the TIP 1.6 and 1.7 and what would have been the ending of the old revision of the TIP project, and turn that into a thing about the role that creationists have had to gain power in the Republican Party and to retool society to fit their agendas. And that stuff, I've got big swaths of material that will connect up into that thing if I ever need another little book to work on, just to while away the time. Plus all of the Paralogs of Fog's novels that I'll be churning out book by book by book, about a quarter way solidly. The little fly has been placed aboard the Britannic in that hot summer of 1876. So we keep busy on all of that material and keep up with all of that. If we can live in societies where we still have free access to information and we are not facing a tyranny of stupidity, which inevitably comes about when governments try to control their population, and they have to control what information is, and it stifles in creativity, it stifles progress, and though they might retain power for a while, in the long run, it shoots their own foot off and creates dark ages. So we don't want that now, do we? We've had enough dark ages. We want to continue. We need to have a nice Star Trek world, and we need that, and to get that, we just look at how many people in the Star Trek world, and there are, and how many of them are not Trumpistas, to the contrary. That tells you a lot. In fact, one of the little tropes I want to try to encourage, not that Tortugan is doing on, but you can ask, is somebody a Tortugan? If they are, they should not be in political office, regardless of what their philosophy is, because they can ignore information too easily. They need to be aloha, which is that whole Hawaiian concept of being generous and kind and civil. And then the other name, they need to be Trek, which is somebody that embodies the principles of Roddenberry-style Trek world of infinite diversity and tolerance and progress and curiosity. So if you say, oh my, not a Tortugan, they are aloha, they are Trek. Those are people that you would want to pay attention to. Tortugans, not aloha, not Trek, no, not a good idea. So feel free to spread the word on all that topic. Buy the books. If you can become a supporter of the project through the Patreon, please do so. Everybody helps, even if it's just only if you can afford it. If even $1 a month, if that's a little sidebar to your little credit thing, and you can spare that without a worry, it's well appreciated. And enough people do it, it's amazing what can be done. So anyway, thanks everybody on this bloody hot wee hours. We're down at 88 degrees here in the den. And we'll see you next week. And in 2 weeks, we'll have another installment of the Casey Luskin Show, where I am not anticipating any papers really supporting their position, but we'll find out paper by paper by paper. We're going to go through every bloody one of them. So anyway, everybody, see you all in next week. Stay safe. Watch out for wooden penguins. They're especially volatile this time of year in this hot weather. Ending